Do you want to be made well? Do you want to be made well? Friends, this is a simple question with a not so simple answer. Do we want to be rescued? Do we want to be free? Do we want to be healed? As I reflect on the passion that God has birthed and sustained in me for undoing racism and resisting oppression in various forms, and for building my and others' capacity to be radically transformed by each other's cultural differences, it feels to me that this is essentially a matter of healing. Inner healing, not just outer healing, is really at the root of things. We are plagued at this time in history, as times past in history, with a gaping wound, a rotting sore, a massive disorder that infects and affects our individual and collective minds, relationships, laws, economics, schooling, the very land that we are sitting on, and yes, so much of the assembly that we call church. This illness, that of the legacy of white supremacy, is, and I don't use this word lightly, a pandemic. Like a persistent worldwide fever, or maybe more like a steady and stealthy flesh-eating disease, it has spread well past its centuries-old origins in Europe, and through colonization and slavery and ongoing empire building, it has touched almost every corner of the world that we are on. By white supremacy, of course, I don't mean just the extremists like the KKK and the Proud Boys in America, or the Jobbik of Hungary, or Generation Identity in France, or Combat 18 in the United Kingdom, or the thousands of anti-Semitic groups that have formed in Argentina and Ecuador and Peru and Mexico and Colombia and Spain. I don't mean the original Nazi ideas that spread and adapted as far as Southeast Asia. No, by white supremacy, I mean the whole web of institutions and structural relationships, policies and practices, attitudes and behaviors that uphold the basic racial argument that whiteness is the standard, that what is white is more evolved than everyone else, that whiteness is superior to all, that it is fundamentally, by virtue of its whiteness, good. By white supremacy, I mean everything that, beginning in the 18th and 19th centuries, began to order our world as if white dominance is the only means for us all to survive. White supremacy is something I spend a lot of my time talking about, teaching about, even singing about. I focus my efforts and attention on whoever is genuinely seeking interventions for themselves and future generations. In my work, I center on the origin of the problem, its mutations and evolution over time, its current status as a global dis-ease, and striving towards its eradication. This work is rewarding, it is energizing, it is hope-giving, it is challenging. This moving from place to place and dispensing knowledge that helps make and unmake a world is sometimes frustrating and life-giving. It helps that I have come to lean increasingly more heavily on God's Spirit as a primary source of guidance and strength. It helps that I believe and know this work of radical dismantling and rebuilding belongs ultimately to the sovereign power and deliverer who, quite frankly, will outlast the earth and who is infinitely bigger than myself. Recently, it has also been the accounts of the man by the waters of Bethzatha and the man with many possessions that have felt most applicable to this calling that I have accepted. The story of the man in John 5 is such a peculiar one, especially in light of the more popular miracles we know, like the woman pressing through the crowd, or the man who couldn't walk being lowered through the roof by his friends. As I explore the text, I want to name that I feel conscious of and sensitive to the fact that some of us right now might be experiencing a need for actual healing in our bodies, or have been diagnosed with a disease that doctors say is incurable. For some of us in this room or our loved ones, sickness is not a metaphor. In fact, one of the reasons I like this text so much is that the New Revised Standard Version says only that the man was ill. It doesn't say he was lame. It doesn't say he was blind. It doesn't say that he specifically was in any way physically impaired. This point will become increasingly important as I unpack the text. In John 5, we encounter a man who has been ill for 38 years. He has been lying beside the pool where healings are said to happen. We don't know for how long. It could be months. It could have been decades. What we know is that it has been a long enough time that when God in Jesus crosses the man's path, it is obvious he has not moved. Seeing the condition the man is in, God in Jesus wastes no time and asks the question that I began with: do you want to be made well? Interestingly, there is no clever banter as with the Syrophoenician woman. There's no commentary on the man's faith like the man with the sick daughter. There's just the meeting, the observation, the question, and the response. And this is where I have to credit Apostle Dion Hunt from my church for pointing out something that I had not noticed before, that the man did not actually answer the question. The man doesn't say yes. The man doesn't say no. Instead, the man describes the barriers in his situation. There are interpersonal factors. No one will help him. There appear to be systemic factors. Every time he tries to get into the pool, someone else gets in before him. But none of that actually gets to the heart of the issue at hand, his desire or non-desire to be made well at all. Hearing these words, God in Jesus doesn't deny that the circumstances exist. He doesn't address the man's non-responses at all. But God in Jesus also does not allow the man to stay there either. He directs him. Stand up. Take up your mat and walk. And the man does just that. Now, one way to look at this exchange is to assume that a miracle has taken place. God and Jesus has done it again. And yet, while I know that it's risky business to take liberties with the text, it feels like this encounter could just as easily not be supernatural. What if the man's illness was actually his mindset? What if his illness was choosing against his own freedom? What if the definition of wellness was to become intolerant of the distorted and the grotesque condition he had gotten used to tolerating? What if the miracle was really a reframing? Quote, I could continue to make my bed in this state of unwellness and accept the condition that I have been in, or I could stand up, take up what is mine to carry, and walk it out in wholeness instead. This way of reading the text, if I continue doing so, connects well to this work to make and unmake a world beyond white supremacy that I dare say the church is called to. Moreover, it has liberating potential both to those who are the main beneficiaries of white supremacy and for those who experience violence and exclusion because of it. For one thing, seeing this as a shift, as a healing of mind, as a healing of spiritual brokenness, as a healing of damaged understanding, seeing this as healing from a shift of accepting what need not be accepted, empowers those who have advantage and those who are subjected to advantage. It takes us away from a posture of resignation. It takes us away from, it's just the way the world works. It takes us away from, this stuff is going to be here with us forever. It takes us away from, it is what it is. For those categorized as white, I see in this story an invitation to consider how deep the desire for wellness, by which I mean a life without racial hierarchies, really runs. Like, really how deep is your desire to be rescued from a state in which white supremacy is eating us all alive? Really? Because sometimes, and this is to be really honest, I find that white folks profess something that sounds more like, can we have a little less leprosy, Lord? To put it in concrete terms, people might say that they want the end of racist police violence, but when activists start petitioning to divest millions of dollars from police budgets to solutions that create healed communities, we can't hear because the word defund trips us up. People might say that they want an end to discrimination, but when it comes time to tackle the work in the congregation, there's never enough money in the budget and no concerted effort to find the funds. People might say, let's make a land statement, but there's no serious conversation with indigenous people about tithing to their communities or giving any of the land back. People might be swift to angry, and I use angry as a verb. There's a lot of angrying on social media. But when it comes time to be in relationship with and solidarity with actual people, there's more worry about making mistakes than taking the steps to fail and learn. Do you want to be made well? God in Jesus is asking. And the answer in return for so many of us is, look at the barriers. Or do we really have to take it all that far? For those of us categorized as Black and other people of color, I believe John 5 invites us to consider how deep the desire for wellness is inside of us too, albeit in a different way. I see this text speaking to me as a form of permission to claim the healing that is already accessible to me. God in Jesus is fully aware that there are issues preventing the man from making it to the pool. He's clear that there is unfairness in the situation. And yet, he tells the man to claim the power that he does have, even with the conditions around him. He invites the man to stand up, take up what he owns, what belongs to him, and walk it out in wholeness anyway. For me, as a Black woman, immigrant living in the United States, standing up, taking up what is mine, and walking in healing has looked like doing inner work with a counselor and with coaches. It's looked like choosing to express myself in music and African dance. It looks like working alongside other Black people for justice here in Elkhart. It looks like putting myself in more Black spaces. It looks like living in more laughter and more peace and more joy and more love, regardless of all the craziness that is going on. Choosing to be made well is not just in the realm of the personal. It also looks like chipping away bit by bit at white supremacy in every organization that the Lord God allows me to set a foot into. I don't want a little less leprosy. I want to walk toward the cure. So with God's help, I am standing up and doing my best to whittle away at it from the inside to the out. Now, interestingly enough, and thanks to my mom, Judith, who I always credit her for this, I've come to see the account of the man with many possessions, the one we call, quote unquote, the rich young ruler, as a helpful parallel to the occurrence in John 5. Like the story of the man by the water, Mark 10 is also a story of healing, though the need here is not to be rescued from being stuck in the same place for a long time, but rather the need is to be rescued from the false idea that the bare minimum, that not doing, that avoiding the most egregious and overt of harms is enough. In this account, the man goes to God in Jesus with what I choose to see as a sincere desire to know if he is on the right track in doing what is right and what is good. To read him as sincere is quite different from the way I used to read him and actually was taught to read him. It's quite frankly very different from the way that he gets set up even in the Believer's Bible commentary. It's very interesting to see how he is positioned in that text. To call him, quote, the rich young ruler immediately throws up a wall between him and us, making it quite difficult to see him in ourselves and ourselves in him. It makes him easy to judge, as greedy, as enslaved to his stuff, as fallen. After all, he is part of the elite, condemned class, is he not? God in Jesus replies to the man with love, with various pieces of the law. The man has done all these things, but these really are the basics. They are the minimum standards. Then God in Jesus invites and points out one thing he lacks, one aspect of himself that he hasn't cultivated as yet. And this part he can grow and he can heal by selling every single thing he has and giving it to those who need it much more than he does. I want each person in this room to close their eyes and to imagine themselves in the scene for a second. God in Jesus comes to you and says, the one thing is to give away, no, take each piece and sell it, and then give away the proceeds. I want you to think about that thing that you really love in your living room. I want you to think about that gift that you got. I want you to think about all the stuff in your garage, maybe, or in your bedroom that you might have to sort through. Would you be happy at this instruction? Or would you grieve? We might not be rich or young or rulers or all three, but I would venture that there isn't a single person in this room that doesn't have many possessions. Things that we don't need, things that we don't use, things that have no function, maybe things that have function. Would you be happy? Or would you grieve? I would grieve. To me, the point of the story is not only a commentary on wealth, it's also about the barriers, the blocks, the obstacles, the things we lack or the things we have that make it feel like the bare minimum is really all we need to do. Or to put it differently, that makes it feel impossible to go beyond the basics to bring thriving to ourselves and to others. Not murdering, not lying, not defrauding, not committing adultery, not dishonoring the very people that birthed you. These are good things. They keep the social order from falling into total chaos. But what is the man with many possessions doing? What proactive step is he taking to gain a more whole and healed way of living for himself and for others? There is a work that requires more stretching than sanctimoniousness. that requires more than simply refraining from being a terrible person. And it is that work that God and Jesus is calling him to. To bring it to modern times and in the context of white supremacy, as I have been discussing, and we are coming close to a close, it's not enough to not be overtly racist. It is not enough to not vote for that guy. It's not enough to be mad about the people over there doing the worst. It's not enough to not talk to those cousins or to unfriend those people. It's not enough to focus on the most hateful bad actors. While it is absolutely important to work at healing the big fiery messes in our society, we also cannot forget that we, right here, well-meaning siblings in the body of Christ, also need to be made well. That healing of the world requires tending to the logs and the specks in my own eye. And white supremacy is in us too. Friends, that white supremacy was in my mirror when I wanted to be white as a child. That white supremacy is in my throat when I can't bring myself to speak with my accent in dominant spaces. That white supremacy is here when we don't examine the standards we hold others to. That white supremacy is here in our church libraries and in the art on our church walls and in our spending and the makeup of our social circles. It's in our self-talk. It's in who makes us feel afraid and who makes us feel comfortable. This isn't meant to shame or guilt trip us. It's simply to name the depth of the healing that we must be willing to face if we're really going to be able to imagine ourselves out of this world into something else. The wonderful thing about the text about the man with many possessions that many of us often miss is that while people tend to write the end of his story and condemn him in the process, the text doesn't make that call. It says he walks away grieving, like most of us in this room probably would do. It doesn't say whether he eventually says yes. It doesn't say if he eventually says no. Friends, the threats to our ability to live well together, to live peace together, to live peace across our differences, to live peace in our own minds and our own hearts and with our very own selves are not all just out there. Over the years, as an agitator and as an activist, I have come to believe that most creatures are doing the best that we can with the tools that we have in a world that is currently designed to feed off of brokenness. And if this is so, then the question of being made well is just not some woo-woo thing that we can dismiss as being inconsequential. It is an essential part of how we imagine, create, and invite others into an existence that is radically different, and that is radically good, and that is radically whole for everyone. We didn't want the sermon to just be words flying in the room. And those are a lot of words. But we wanted to extend an invitation for people to embody a response. What are the mindsets? What are the stories we tell ourselves, regardless of what background that we have, that prevent us from throwing ourselves into this work? What keeps us from stretching beyond the bare minimum? Some of us are tired. Some of us feel hopeless. Some of us are confused. Some of us want to be validated. Some of us get stuck in overthinking. Some of us get stuck in perfectionism. Some of us were taught things that they're hard to let go of. And so we wanted to invite, and I'll ask the different people that have agreed to participate from the front and in the back in this exercise. We want to invite you to think about, what do you need to be made well? Not because anybody in this room who's coming up here has some kind of special power, but because we serve a God in whom all things are possible. And if there is something that feels like a barrier, if there's something that feels like a block, if there's something that feels like it keeps you stuck from either putting down some of this dominant stuff or prevents you from rising up in the power that God has given you, then we invite you to walk to any of the people here in the room, and you can kneel or bow your head, and the person will ask you the words of Jesus, do you want to be made well? And you can say yes. And they will help you up and tell you to get up and move. There will be special music as you sort of examine. And this is not one of the things where everybody has to come or don't come. Really, if you feel led, feel free.